So, hello everybody. Thanks for joining. And as Tamara said, we'll be looking at how to build a data pipeline without data, and I'll show you how to use synthetic data to do that. So, yeah, I've already been introduced, but just a little bit about myself. I'm a data scientist at Melio. We help build and deploy data-intensive applications to unlock value from your data. You can check us out on LinkedIn, and if you want to you can check out some of my stuff on GitHub or email me via my email address here. I'll share this again towards the end of the presentation so you don't have to take notes or anything. So just quickly, what we'll be looking at, we'll be looking firstly at what are data pipelines and why do we need them. And then we'll go into some of the challenges of building and testing these data pipelines. And then I'll show you how you can use synthetic data for testing your data pipelines. And we'll cover some specific tools and methods that you can use for doing this with Python. And then we'll finish out with some benefits and challenges with regards to synthetic data generation. So just for definition purposes, what I mean by data pipeline in this talk is a series of operations that is used to extract, load, transform, validate, or write data. And it's usually from various sources into some target file system, database, or data warehouse. So sometimes we might not have access to real data that we want to use in our data pipelines or the applications that depend on them. And this could be for various reasons. Sometimes the data is sensitive or confidential and the data owners are not allowed to share it. Sometimes the data hasn't even been collected yet, but we want to start building some pipelines and apps that will consume it once it's ready. And also sometimes it could be too large or too complex for some simple initial testing that we might want to do. So obviously without real data, it becomes very challenging to design or build any of these downstream applications that need to consume the data. And it's also tricky to start developing the ETL logic or test the functionality and the performance of our data pipeline. So this is where synthetic data comes into play. So what I mean by synthetic data is just some artificially generated data that somehow mimics the characteristics and the behaviors of the real data that we eventually want to use. And the synthetic data can help us it provides us with a realistic enough sample that we can, so we can start building our data pipelines with. And because we have control over this, we can set the size and shape and distributions of the synthetic data, which enables us to more realistically create different scenarios and edge cases that we might want to test. And because it's not real data, we can also reduce the risk of exposing sensitive or confidential data. So in this demo, I will show you how to create synthetic data, and we'll use a Python package called Faker to actually create the synthetic data. And then I'll also show you how to use Flyway to load the synthetic data that we've created into a Postgres database. And you'll see a bit later, Flyway is nice for repeatable deployments. And then we can get started testing our data pipelines. So for this demo, let's imagine that we just started a brand new e-commerce website, and we have some vague idea of the customers and products we'll have, and we know that there'll be some transactions between them. So just for a rough schematic diagram, we will know we'll have our database, and inside it we'll have a couple of tables where we can track details about our customers, like their name, email, phone, city, etc. Similarly, for the products, we can track the product name, the description, maybe the price, and then we can keep a record of all the transactions, which is basically just the customer interacting with a specific product, and then we can also specify the quantity that they might have purchased. And you'll see a bit later, I wanted to show an extra detail about Faker where we can capture some device-specific information as well. So let's pretend that we care about device information in this example as well. So we'll get this information from our customers and their interactions, and then we can eventually build some data pipelines or dashboards to see how well our business is doing. And we obviously want this to work in the ideal case as soon as we get real customers. But we don't have any customers yet, let's say. So we also don't have data for them. So we can make some, and this is where the synthetic data comes in. We can populate this with fake data, and then we can start building any of the downstream things that depend on it. So now we understand what we're trying to do here. Now I'll go into a little bit of the code, and I can show you some of the tools you can use to do this. So in this case, we'll use SQL Alchemy to create the database objects, and we can use Faker to generate the synthetic data. So I just showed some specific imports that you can do here, but basically we'll use SQL Alchemy to define like table objects, and we'll define the schema for each table using specific data types, and we'll use this declarative base to extend it so we can create specific table objects, which you'll see just now. And then for Faker, it's as simple as importing Faker and creating an instance of the class. And then you'll see how we can use some of Faker's methods to generate some of this synthetic data. So now we'll start by creating some like placeholder classes for capturing the information of our customers, products, and transactions. And this is done by extending that base class that we imported from SQL Alchemy. And you'll see in the following couple of slides, I'll follow this format where we define the class to capture some information, and then I'll show you a helper function that we can use to generate instances of it. So starting with the customers, we can define the schema here, like we want an integer for the customer ID, for their name we want a string, etc. And then the same for email, phone, address, city, and country, all the things we are interested in capturing for our customer in our database. And this is an example of a helper function that we can use to populate some of these fields with the synthetic data that we get from Faker. So I just defined this generate customer helper function, and we need to pass it an ID integer, and that is just used in the instantiation of the class, so we can get an actual customer object. And for the name, email, phone, address, etc., we use Faker. Remember that Faker object that we instantiated earlier? Here you can see now how easy it is to use Faker. So it comes built in with a set of nice methods like name, and it gives you a name. And the same for email, phone number, street address. You can just call these methods, and it gives you a nice string for name or address or whatever. And now we have an instance of our customer object. So now we basically repeat the process for our product. So in this product class, we create like a placeholder column for name, description, category, and price. The only new thing is here is that price will be a numeric feature instead of a string. And then when we get to the helper function for generating products, similarly, we pass just an integer that specifies the ID. And then we can have, we can use some more Faker's built-in methods for, I just used word here because this would be the name of a product. And for the description, I used the built-in sentence method. which generates a random English sentence in this case. And you might argue that this wouldn't be a description and it'd be correct, but I think there's an important point to make here as well. You have to know how realistic your synthetic data needs to be. You can, of course, adapt this and make it more realistic if your use case demands that. But for this example, it should suffice to just have some English words that somehow represents a description. And then when you want to use some more custom methods with Faker, you can use this is one of the methods that allows you to do that, random element, where you feed it a set of elements and it'll actually randomly sample uniformly from this set and pick one of those to populate, in this case, the category. So you can also, for the numerical case here, I used the PyDecimal method, and I gave it 3 digits on the left-hand side of the decimal and 2 on the right, so that it resembles the price. And I constrained it to be always positive, which would make sense for a price. And that is our product data. Then we move on to the device, and here it's the same thing. We create a device class, and we want to capture the platform, their IPv4 address, as well as their MAC address. And this is the part that I wanted to show you. So there's a method in Faker called user agent, which is really nice. It gives you a long string that gives you information about a device that a person might have used. So that includes their operating system, the browser name that they used on that device, as well as the browser version, etc. So you can create synthetic data around that if your use case demands it. And then IPv4 for an IP address. You can also go further and tell Faker to use public IP addresses or private IP addresses. So you can easily distinguish between that. And then the MAC address you can get by just calling the MAC address method. So finally, we'll have our transaction class, which will store the date of an interaction as well as the customer ID and the product ID which they interacted with. Then we can keep track of the quantity and the device that they used, as well as a payment method. So I think the only new things here are now, instead of just passing an ID for the transaction, like generation helper function, I made it sort of pick from our set of existing customers, products, and devices. So this is like just an example if you wanted to add a little bit more realism into your synthetic data. So you can kind of build links between things. So for date time, there's a useful method called date between, and you can pass it a start and an end date of your range that you want to sample from. And here you can see we passed in a list of customer objects, which we randomly select from, and then we just grab its ID to get our customer ID. And similarly for the product and the device. This is also a new method, random int, which is just a random integer within some range, in this case between 1 and 20. And then I just used that random element method again to select different payment methods. You can extend this. You can put any. You can even put other data types in here if you don't want to use strings. Right. So now that we have our classes and helper functions for generating instances of them, we can actually run them, like call them in a loop basically, and populate a list of specific customers, devices, and products. So how I did this was I just used some list comprehension, which is like a compressed for loop, and I created 1,000 customers, 60 products, and 1,000 devices, and then passed those lists of customers, products, and devices to the generate transactions function that we just looked at before, so that it could sample specific ones from them, and we generated 5,000 transactions. And at this point, we have some synthetic data. We have some customers, products, and devices, and they have some specifics that have been populated by Faker. And before I move on, I just want to mention with Faker, you can specify the locale for what the type of data you want. So the default is US English, and that's why when you call the sentence method, it would give you an English sentence, for example, and the same as goes for names, addresses, number plates, and phone numbers. So you can also pass it other locales like Germany or Italy or wherever, and it will then change the synthetic data generator to suit that. So you can have like Chinese names or whatever your use case demands. That's also you can do that with Faker. And if you run out of useful built-in methods for Faker and you wanted to do something more specific that it doesn't do, you can look. It's easy to extend. So there's actually a community that builds extensions for Faker. So you can just look at their documentation, head over to the community section and see what has been built already. Most likely you'll find something there that you need. And if still there's something that has not been implemented, you can obviously build a custom implementation where you extend Faker. So it's really the things that I've shown here are mostly the out of the box methods that help with some maybe more basic cases, but you're not limited in any way. All right, so now that we have our synthetic data as objects in Python, we want to write it to our database. So we have a choice here. Because we used SQL Alchemy, we can just use that to write it to our database. But I want to show you Flyway, specifically because it handles version control of SQL scripts, and it handles migrations in a nice way, so you can get repeatable deployments and you can have more certainty about the state of your database. And this is very helpful when you are working on the contents of a database collaboratively with other developers. For example, you might have done a quick fix on the staging database, right? And now you're wondering, well, did we do that in the dev portion, or is that replicated in prod as well? I don't know. And this gets like, maybe this is a simple example, but if there are many developers working together, it can easily get out of hand. So with Faker, you would run a migration, and it'll detect what changes have been made where, and you can easily just kind of one click, hit a button kind of thing, and you can be sure of the database state and be consistent. So that's why I want to show you Faker. So like I mentioned, Flyway. It's almost like Git for your database. You can think of it as that. So we need to get these create and insert statements and save them as SQL files so that Flyway can keep track of it. And these scripts will contain the information necessary to create our tables and insert our synthetic data into it. So we need to now convert what we did before with Faker and these Python objects to some string representation that looks like a SQL query, and then we can write that to a file. And from there, we can use Flyway. So to do this, we have a choice again. We can just do some string manipulation, One example of how you can do this is with an F string. You can write your SQL script for creating a table, and you can just use string interpolation to put the table name here, which you can grab from the Python object. And then you can save this to a file. Or because we use SQL Alchemy, you can do this in a more automated way, so you don't maybe put a typo here and things won't work. This is maybe a little bit more robust to that. So this is an example of how you can do that. So you would use the create table class from SQL Alchemy, and you would define your engine. In this case, we'll just have a sort of temporary in-memory database so that we can compile the string representation of this insert or create table statement. So we would put one of our classes, like the customers class, right? And we can compile it with SQL Alchemy and get the string representation of that. And then this would look something like this. And so that handles the table creation. And now for our insert statements, we can again do like a string interpolation here, where we grab let's say the ID and the name for one of our customers and insert it into the customers table. Or we can use SQL Alchemy by using this insert statement here. So again, we pass it our class that we're interested in, and then we pass it a list of records, which we get from the helper function. And then again, we would compile it and get the string representation of that. And these are just two alternative ways that you can get the string. So you can write it to a file. And then from this point, now we are ready to start using Flyway. So you can use the CLI of Flyway, or if you prefer, there's a desktop UI version as well, which I'll show you now. So you would have to install the CLI and then do some simple configuration to point it to the database where you want to store your synthetic data in, and or the database that you want to track any changes on. And yeah, you can also select the specific schemas inside the database that you want to track. So once you've set it all up, you can start off by running this command flyway clean, which will drop all the tables, views, procedures, etc. from the configured schemas, and you can start fresh. So this is useful to do in the beginning. You wouldn't do this on a production database, but you have to run this for Flyway to kind of have a starting point, so you can start tracking it. And then when you're ready, when you have your SQL scripts, like we just showed how we would create that, we can run Flyway migrate, and that'll detect all the changes that have not been made yet on our database, and it would run those scripts in order so we can have our tables with our synthetic data in them. And now I'll quickly just show you the Flyway desktop. So you would also have to install this and configure it, but it's relatively simple. And then it would look something like this, where you can connect to your database. There you can see, okay, so I'll select the clean option here, give it permission to erase data and run the clean, and then it would start off fresh, and then you'll see all these items in a pending state to show that there are scripts that have been detected, but they haven't been applied yet. So now we have, this is the UI way of getting a clean database to start working from. And then after that, you would run the migrate again by just selecting it from the drop-down. Sorry, this is like a GIF that runs in a loop. So you would select migrate, run the migrate, which applies those scripts that haven't been applied yet, and then you get a nice statement like that showing you that they've been applied successfully. And that's what Flyway desktop looks like. And then to inspect the data, you can use something like pgadmin and go to your database, and you can see down here the tables that we've created for our customers and products, etc. And if you view that, you'll see the actual names, emails, phones, examples that this was generated with Faker. So that's how it would look like after you've run the Flyway migration. And then just quickly some pros and cons of synthetic data overall. Like you've seen, it can speed up your development and testing processes, especially if you don't have real data available yet. You can start building, and you can also use it to increase coverage of your test, as well as the quality of your test by covering certain edge cases. But you also might not be able to capture all the nuances and variations of your real data. So there's a limitation to this, and it might require some extra effort and resources to maintain your synthetic data. So just lastly, some tips and best practices if you're thinking about using this. It's always useful to define the scope and the purpose of your synthetic data beforehand, so you don't unnecessarily waste time to try and create like perfectly realistic data, unless of course your use case demands it, but only build what's necessary. That could save you a lot of time. And then you can use existing tools and libraries to do this, like I've shown here. And it's always good to verify your synthetic data against real data schemas or business rules if you have those available, and then just document your process so that when other consumers of your synthetic data, or if other people want to consume it, they know what to expect from it. So yeah, we've looked at some challenges of building it. You've seen how to build these synthetic data with Python to test your pipelines. Then we've also shown how to use Flyway to migrate that into a database. And that is what it. Sorry, I rushed a bit in the end there, so there's time for questions. Here's all my contact details, and I've put all of this on GitHub. Here's the QR code for how you can get there, and then you can see detailed like notebooks and steps that I've used to set this all up, and you can try and do the same if you would like to play with it. Thank you. I see there's some chat questions. Do you also consider Alembic as an alternative to Flyway? Yeah, I think you can do that. I haven't done that myself, but I think you would also be able to still use Faker to populate the synthetic data portion of that. And then there's another, I hope that's answered the question. Let me know if it didn't. And then there's another question. It says, what kind of pros and cons of synthetic data in terms of using them as a proxy to personal data? What kind of metrics would you suggest to assess privacy and utility of synthetic data? That's an interesting question. I think, I don't know about metrics for assessing those, but you can, there's actually another tool out there called SDV, which you can give it a sample of your real data if you have that available, which could include some personal data. And it trains a model on that to detect some of the patterns and the data types that you have in there. And then you can use it to generate synthetic data. And I think it has some guarantees on the privacy. So if that sounds interesting, you can look at that. I hope that answers the question.